Chapter 4. What about the children? Kids today are safer than ever. When you open this door, just push on the wood here. Never use the doorknob. I'm always afraid that it will shatter into a million pieces and that one of them will hit my eye. Lemony Snicket, A Series of Unfortunate Events, The Wide Window. When my brother and I were teenagers and we stayed out late with our friends, my parents had one non-negotiable demand. If they were in bed, we had to tap them on the shoulder as soon as we got home. Until they knew that their sons were secure, they were too nervous to sleep well. Parents have a lot of worries, but fear for their kids' physical safety has got to be the most traumatic. If you're trying to make parents feel better, it's counterproductive to remind them that parents have little or no effect on their kids' health. Accepting the inevitability of minor risks often makes you feel better. Unless you're Mr. Spock, though, telling yourself, "I can't control the horrible things that happen to children these days," will only make you feel worse. But how would you react if I said that the risks that modern children face are minor? You probably wouldn't believe me. I'd have to be blind to miss what happened to this country over the last 50 years. Villainy is all over the news. Still, if you did believe me, you would feel better about being or becoming a parent. What a relief it would be to discover that the nightmarish world we seem to inhabit is only a bad dream. The good news about bad news. There are many kinds of safety. Some are vague, so let's start with the hardest of hard numbers. Mortality statistics. Mortality statistics tell us the fraction of people who died during a year. In the broad scheme of things, how safe are our little ones? The answers are easy to find and hard to dispute. Every year, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention publish the authoritative National Vital Statistics reports. Here are the numbers for 2005, the latest available year. They're straight out of the original document with one small adjustment. Since the report doesn't count overseas deaths, I've added fatalities of U.S. armed forces killed in hostile action. With the important exception of babies, children are the safest people in the United States. My 7-year-olds may look vulnerable, but they are almost 12 times as safe as I am, and over 100 times as safe as their grandparents. The twins' annual chance of death is 16.3 out of 100,000, which means their chance of staying alive is 99.9837%. If my sons could forever remain as safe as they are now, their life expectancy would exceed 6,000 years. Although I wish they were invulnerable, I'm not losing sleep over my own mortality. Wouldn't it be paranoid to sweat bullets about my children's safety when they're far more secure than I am? Still, weren't kids a lot safer back in the 50s? Good question. When I'm teaching, I often present a standard story, then explain why the standard story is wrong. The idyllic 50s is one of my favorites. Imagine a comically pompous narrator. The year, 1950. The place, the United States of America. There's never been a better time or place to be a kid. Children happily play kick the can and stickball on their tree-lined streets. Their parents can relax inside and read the evening newspaper because they know that their children are safe. In 1950, the worst thing an American child has to fear is a skinned knee. Alas, 1950 is just a distant memory. Now children live in a much darker and more dangerous world. No decent parent would let her kids roam the neighborhood unsupervised. Her precious children could be run down by a careless motorist, snatched by a nefarious stranger, or gunned down by a disturbed peer. True, we're materially richer than we used to be. Yet in the 50s, parents had something all our money can't buy: peace of mind. The idyllic 50s is a little cartoonish. All my standard stories are. But it captures the way we see the evolution of childhood, as a tale of Pleasantville lost. Fortunately for us, the idyllic 50s confuses television and reality. On television, children's lives sharply deteriorated over the last half-century. On Leave It to Beaver, a kid's worst fate is getting a black eye from a pugnacious girl. On Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, child murder, and sexual abuse seem as common as jaywalking. If you turn off your television and look at the U.S. mortality numbers for 1950 versus 2005, however, you'll see a different story. Forget everything you think you know about the golden age of childhood. People are much safer than they used to be, especially kids. In 1950, more than 3% of kids didn't live to see their first birthday. That's about one missing child for every classroom in the country. Conditions today aren't merely better. They improved so much that government statisticians changed their denominator from deaths per 1,000 to deaths per 100,000. You might think that children under 5 are safer because they have so little contact with the increasingly frightening outside world. What happens once kids go to school and meet our sick, twisted society? The answer? Even though school-age children were already the safest people in the country back in 1950, we managed to make them almost 4 times as safe. If the numbers seem counterintuitive or absurd, riddle me this. Have any of the horrible things you see on TV happened to you? To someone you care about? To anyone you personally know? If not, why do you place so much stock in what you see on television, and so little in what you see with your own eyes? Tragedies on Law and Order don't even pretend to be real. Tragedies on CNN are genuine, but they're as misleading as stories about lottery winners. They're news precisely because they are phenomenally unlikely to happen to you. Alas, one of the few things that improved faster than our children's safety is the media's ability to track down the shrinking number of exceptions. The 50s versus today, a closer look at the decline of tragedy. Why did safety improve so much since 1950? To answer this question, we must think some gruesome thoughts. How often do kids die of disease, accidents, war, murder, suicide? The last thing I want to do is freak you out while trying to calm you down. So don't forget our mission, finding out why childhood is so much less tragic than it used to be. Disease. Stories about sick children rarely make the news. Leave it to Beaver, or even Law and Order, SVU. Nevertheless, disease has long been youth's leading killer. When the unthinkable happened to a child under 1, disease was the cause 96% of the time in 1950 and 94% of the time in 2005. The pattern gets less lopsided as kids grow up, but disease remains deadlier than all other causes put together for all kids under 15 years old. Fortunately, disease isn't what it used to be. The greatest killer of youth has become much less deadly, about 80% less for younger kids, and about 70% less for 15 to 24-year-olds. Death from infectious disease has virtually been eradicated. Back in 1950, influenza and pneumonia were responsible for almost 14% of the deaths of children age 1 to 4. By 2005, their chance of death from these diseases was about 30 times smaller. Progress on non-infectious ailments hasn't been as rapid, but is still a great gift. Take heart disease. The death rate for children ages 5 to 14 fell more than 3 times. Suppose that in 1950, a genie let you wish away one cause of death for your children. You would want to pick disease because it is far and away the greatest threat to their lives. Since 1950, this wish practically came true without a genie's help. And it wasn't just one lucky family that got this wish, we all did. Children and their parents have much to be grateful for. Accidents. In 1950, accidents were the second greatest killer of youth of all ages. In 2005, accidents remained the number 2 killer of children under 15. And had become the number 1 killer for 15 to 24-year-olds. Progress? Absolutely. Accidental death rates sharply declined for every age group. Kids under 15 are now almost 4 times as safe as they were in 1950. Even 15 to 24-year-olds who gained the least are about 1.4 times as safe. Accidents became their leading killer because their death rate for disease fell even faster. War. In 1950, American families were losing their sons to the Korean War. In 2005, American families were losing their sons, and occasionally daughters, to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A cynic might say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. At least from the American point of view, however, he'd be wrong. Since 1950, war has radically changed. It isn't that dangerous anymore. The 1950s fatality rate was more than 50 times as high as the fatality rate of 2005. In 1950, parents really had to worry that the government would force their sons to join the army and send them overseas to die. Now the soldiers are volunteers, and they almost always come home alive. Homicide and suicide. The 50s weren't worse in every way. Our homicide and suicide rates are 2 to 4 times as high as they used to be. Before you declare victory for despair, though, remember that homicide and suicide rates continue to be microscopic. They're horrifying, but so rare that you can quadruple the rates for 1950 without having much effect on overall safety. Even 15 to 24-year-olds, the group most likely to die violently, are still more than twice as safe overall. A kind word for the 50s. Compared to modern America, 1950 was a death trap. Yet American parents in 1950 were right to feel that they had given their children a better life. By the standards of 1900, 1950 was a children's paradise. In 1900, over 16% of babies didn't see their first birthday. 1950 was almost 5 times as safe. In 1900, about 2% of kids ages 1-4 didn't make it through the year. 1950 was 14 times as safe. Tragic deaths for older youths became much less common, too. Safety improved 6.5 times for 5 to 14-year-olds, and more than 3 times for 15 to 24-year-olds. The people of 1950 had a triumph over tragedy to celebrate, but so do we. Violent crime. The devastating loss of a child used to be commonplace. Now it's a freak event. Every actual and potential parent should breathe a sigh of relief that she isn't living in 1950 or, God forbid, 1900. Still, there's more to safety than staying alive. What about all the terrible crimes that people commit against children? Hard numbers again contradict popular perception. Whenever Gallup asks, "Is there more crime in the U.S. than there was a year ago or less?" a majority of Americans almost always answers, more. According to crime statistics, however, violent crime has always been rare, especially for children, and recently hit its lowest rate in 30 years. The world is safe and keeps getting safer. We fear for our children because journalists and screenwriters are scary and keep getting scarier. The leading source of American crime statistics, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS, began in 1973. Its goal is to measure how much crime happens, not just how much crime the police hear about. Instead of relying on police reports, the government interviews a nationally representative sample of about 75,000 households to find out whether they've been victimized. In 2008, it estimated a violent crime rate of 19.3 per 1,000 people over the age of 11, less than half the 1973 rate. The most common violent crime by far is simple assault, 67% of violent crimes, followed by aggravated assault, 17%, robbery, 11%, and rape sexual assault, 4%. In the NCVS, roughly 4% of 12 to 24-year-olds are the victim of a violent crime during the course of a year. That is about twice the overall rate. Since young people commit most of the violence, it is hardly surprising that they are also its main victims. Fortunately, the more serious crimes are much less common. For 12 to 24-year-olds, the incidence rate is about 1 in 144 for aggravated assault, and less than 1 in 500 for rape sexual assault. Since this survey is based on interviews with victims 12 and older, it does not count crimes against young children. But according to police reports, kids under 12 are much safer than 12 to 17-year-olds. Their assault rate is about 7 times lower, their robbery rate about 12 times lower, and their forcible sex rate about 2 times lower. The world is far from perfect, but serious crimes against children are rare, and getting rarer. The case of kidnapping. When I was a kid, my mom and dad repeatedly warned me never to get into a stranger's car, no matter how much candy he promised. Although they let me bike all over our neighborhood without supervision, my parents were genuinely afraid of what the FBI calls a stereotypical kidnapping. In a stereotypical kidnapping, the perpetrator is a stranger or slight acquaintance who, 1. Transports the victim 50 or more miles, 2. Detains him overnight, 3. Holds him for ransom, 4. Intends to keep him permanently, or 5. Kills him. If my parents were worried about kidnapping 30 years ago, when people were nice, how often does it happen in modern America? Almost never. For children under 12 years old, the chance of a stereotypical kidnapping is 1 in a million per year. The best source on child abduction in the United States is the Department of Justice's Second National Incident Studies of Missing, Abducted, Runaway, and Thrown-Away Children. Last conducted during 1999, this survey found a total of 115 stereotypical kidnappings for the year. Older children were more likely to be victims, but even for the highest risk group, 12 to 14-year-olds, the odds were just 4 in a million. Your child is about as likely to be the next Lindbergh baby as you are to win world fame for flying from New York to Paris. Once you know these basic facts, it is clear that Lenore Skenazy, the journalist who let her 9-year-old ride the New York subway alone, is not the worst mom in America. I say she's one of the best. If you merely want to curry favor with other parents, go ahead and base your safety decisions on hearsay. If you really care about your children's safety, however, do what Skenazy did. Look at the numbers. Telling your kid to buckle his seatbelt is reasonable. Telling your kid he can't walk to the mailbox alone because he might get abducted is lunacy. Over 200,000 children were kidnapped in 1999, but the vast majority were nothing like the cases on the news. Kidnappers of pre-teens are almost always relatives who are unhappy with their custody status. While these kidnappings are certainly distressing, they almost never lead to physical injuries. The kidnapper returns the child more than 90% of the time. When he doesn't, the rest of the family almost always discovers the child's new location and can easily pursue legal remedies. Is safety-conscious parenting the reason our kids are safer? Walk through the baby safety department of a store with your oldest living relative asking, "Which of these things did you need?" Lenore Skenazy, free-range kids. Modern parents usually say they're safety-conscious because the modern world has become so perilous for kids. They're wrong about the peril. Still, is it possible that parental paranoia is the cause of the massive increase in our children's safety? Once today's typical parents learn the facts, I assume they'll want the credit. Despite the weak evidence for nurture effects on children's health, we can't dismiss the possibility out of hand. Drastically reducing a tiny risk has almost no perceptible effect on life expectancy. Imagine a world where any child who survives his first year lives to be 100 years old. If you reduce his risk of premature death from 100 per 100,000 to 0 per 100,000, you only increase his life expectancy by about 5 weeks. That is too small an effect for even higher quality twin and adoption studies to rule out. Yet if you recall the main causes of youth mortality, it is hard to give parenting much credit. Parents are primarily hyper about accidents and crime, but the overwhelming reason our kids are safer is that disease is so much less deadly. It is unclear how hyper parents could have caused much of this decline. Still, safety-conscious parenting might have played a supporting role. Accident rates declined much less for 15 to 24-year-olds than they did for younger children. Perhaps as kids grow up, they take more and more risks that their fretful parents can no longer veto. Bottom line, while there's no hard proof that safety-conscious parenting works, there is reason to suspect a small benefit. If you have nervous energy to spare, you might as well try a little extra nagging or child-proofing. Whatever you do, however, do not mess with Halloween and spoil everyone's fun. Contrary to urban legends about poisoned candy and apples with razor blades, no child has ever been killed or seriously injured by Halloween treats. Whether or not you go the extra mile to protect your child, don't lament that no matter how hard you try, you can't recreate the 50s. By the standards of the 50s, almost every modern parent is doing great. If you're especially safety conscious, you're doing better than great. Feel free to pat yourself on the back for making your safe child even safer. Prudence, not paranoia. The Baudelaires had not really enjoyed most of their time with her. Not because she cooked horrible cold meals, or chose presents for them that they didn't like, or always corrected the children's grammar, but because she was so afraid of everything that she made it impossible to really enjoy anything at all. Lemony Snicket, A Series of Unfortunate Events, The Wide Window. I have an obsessive personality. It's usually an asset. When I obsess about an idea, I absorb it. When I obsess about a project, I finish it. Sadly, I also occasionally fixate on fruitless topics. I spend hours worrying about unsolvable problems and fantastic scenarios. Sometimes I worry about literally impossible dangers. Negative thoughts stay with me like a song I can't get out of my head. I know as well as anyone then that facts do not instantly bring peace of mind. Still, on the road to peace of mind, learning the facts about children's safety is an important first step. Once you know the facts, you know the kind of problem you face. In an utterly deadly world, worry is a solution. You need to figure out how to protect your kids from danger. In a perfectly safe world, worry is a problem. You need to figure out how to protect yourself from your own anxiety. The real world is neither utterly deadly nor perfectly safe. Caring parents need to strike a balance between fearing the world and fearing fear itself, to be prudent rather than paranoid. Unfortunately, today's typical parent strikes an indefensible balance. At minimum, our fear should have mellowed as the safety of our loved ones rose. Since our kids are almost 5 times as safe as they were in 1950, parents' angst should have mostly melted away. Instead, we've come down with a collective anxiety disorder. Learning the facts about safety is the first step toward feeling better. What steps come next? Trying to prevent all conceivable dangers is tempting, but futile. Everything's slightly risky, even leaving the house. As Lenore Skenazy wisely observes, once you can picture an 8-year-old being dragged down the street by her Hannah Montana backpack while the bus driver digs Zeppelin on his cranked-up off-brand iPod, it certainly seems worth warning the kids to undo their backpack belts. And then, woo, that's one worry off the checklist. The problem is that the checklist just keeps growing. It's like one of those brooms in the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Chop one in half and it comes back as 2. 2 become 4. If parents can't ward off their anxiety by fighting microscopic dangers, what's the alternative? One of psychologists' most effective treatments for anxiety is called exposure therapy. People get over their irrational fears by repeatedly facing them. Suppose you accept that leaving your 12-year-old home alone is as safe as crossing the street, but you're still afraid to do so. After you accept the irrationality of your fear, step 2 is leaving your child at home while you take a short trip to the store. The catch: you have to do it even if it terrifies you. Once a child-free trip to the store no longer makes your palms sweat, face your next phobia. Baby steps are okay, but the lesson of exposure therapy is that to stop being afraid, you have to start doing things that scare you. While it's important to face the fears you've got, there's no reason to channel surf for new nightmares. The horrors that parents see on the news and realistic crime dramas are insanely rare. If they disturb you, stop watching. If you must watch, watch ironically. Fictional shows are merely gripping lies. Even carefully fact-checked journalism is as misleading as infomercials about making millions with no money down. Both dwell on weird outliers. The media's job is to point cameras at the most heartbreaking story on Earth. In a world with 7 billion human beings, the news will always be horrifying. That's no reason to fear for your children. If you have kids, or might one day want them, never forget that we're living in a golden age of safety. The false perception that today's world is dangerous for children is a major source of needless parental suffering. Compared to the idyllic 50s, modern children are amazingly secure. Now more than ever, parents should sleep well, knowing that their progeny are safe.